The encounter. Ethan Morgan's sneakers pounded the cracked sidewalk as he raced towards the bus stop, his backpack bouncing awkwardly against his spine. The crisp autumn air nipped at his cheeks, turning them a rosy red. He could see the bus in the distance, its diesel engine growling as it prepared to pull away from the curb. "Wait," he shouted, waving his arms frantically. "Please, wait." The bus driver, a kind-faced woman with graying hair, caught sight of the boy in her side mirror. With a small smile, she kept the doors open, allowing Ethan to clamber aboard, panting heavily. "Thanks, Miss Johnson," Ethan gasped, fishing in his pocket for his bus pass. "No problem, kiddo," she replied warmly. "Can't have you missing another day of school, can we?" Ethan grinned sheepishly. It wasn't the first time he'd nearly missed the bus this month. Between helping his mom with his younger siblings and trying to finish his homework, mornings were always a chaotic rush in the Morgan household. As he made his way down the aisle, Ethan's eyes scanned for an empty seat. The bus was crowded as usual, filled with a mix of bleary-eyed commuters heading to work and students on their way to various schools across the city. He finally spotted an open space next to an elderly woman near the back and made his way towards it. "Excuse me, ma'am," Ethan said politely. "Is this seat taken?" The woman looked up, her wrinkled face breaking into a kind smile. "Not at all, young man. Please, sit down." Ethan settled into the seat, careful not to bump the woman with his backpack. He couldn't help but notice how neatly dressed she was, wearing a crisp blouse and a string of pearls around her neck. She reminded him a bit of his grandmother, who always insisted on looking her best, even for a trip to the grocery store. As the bus lurched forward, Ethan pulled out his math textbook. He had a test later that day, and he wanted to squeeze in a few more minutes of studying. The woman beside him noticed the book and smiled. "Algebra?" she asked, peering at the cover. "That was always my favorite subject in school." Ethan looked up, surprised. "Really? Most people I know hate math." The woman chuckled. "Oh, I loved it. There's something beautiful about the logic of numbers, don't you think? The way everything fits together like a puzzle." Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I kind of like it too. But don't tell my friends I said that," he added with a grin. "They already think I'm weird enough." The woman was about to respond when a commotion from the front of the bus caught their attention. A large man with a scruffy beard had boarded, and he was arguing loudly with the bus driver. "I told you, I don't have any change," the man shouted, his words slightly slurred. "Just let me ride, will ya?" Miss Johnson's voice was firm but calm. "I'm sorry, sir, but you need to pay the fare or exit the bus. Those are the rules." The man's face turned red with anger. "Rules? I'll show you rules." He stumbled down the aisle, grabbing onto seats to keep his balance. The other passengers watched warily, some shrinking back in their seats to avoid attracting his attention. As the man approached their section, Ethan felt the woman beside him tense up. He glanced at her and saw fear in her eyes. The man's gaze locked onto the pearl necklace around her neck, and a predatory grin spread across his face. Well, he slurred, leaning in close. "Aren't you a fancy lady? How about sharing some of that wealth, huh?" The woman clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles turning white. "Please," he said softly, "leave me alone." But the man wasn't listening. He reached out, his grimy fingers grasping at the pearl necklace. "Come on, Grandma. You don't need all this fancy stuff." Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest. He knew he should do something, but fear kept him frozen in place. He wasn't big or strong. What could he possibly do against this adult man? But then he remembered something his dad had told him once. "Sometimes, son, doing the right thing means being scared and doing it anyway." Taking a deep breath, Ethan stood up. His legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to speak. "Hey, leave her alone." The man turned, seeming almost amused by the interruption. "Mind your own business, kid," he growled. Ethan's voice shook, but he pressed on. "This is my business. You're scaring her, and that's not okay. Please, just leave her alone and get off the bus." For a moment, the man looked stunned. Then his face twisted with rage. "You little brat." He lunged forward, grabbing Ethan by the front of his shirt. Panic surged through Ethan, but he didn't back down. "Help," he shouted. "Somebody help." His cry seemed to break the spell of fear that had gripped the other passengers. Suddenly, people were standing up, moving towards them. A burly construction worker stepped forward, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "Let the kid go," he said firmly. "Now." Outnumbered and suddenly faced with adult opposition, the man's bravado deflated. He released Ethan, nearly shoving him back into his seat, and stumbled towards the front of the bus. Miss Johnson had already radioed for police assistance. As they pulled up to the next stop, 2 officers were waiting. They quickly apprehended the man, leading him off the bus as he shouted incoherent protests. As the bus doors closed and they pulled away from the curb, a strange silence fell over the passengers. Then, slowly, people began to applaud. Ethan felt his face grow hot with embarrassment as several passengers patted him on the back or offered words of praise. "That was very brave, young man," the elderly woman said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you." Ethan shrugged, feeling uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what anyone would do," he mumbled. The woman shook her head. "No, not anyone. It takes a special kind of courage to stand up for others, especially when you're afraid. You should be proud of yourself." As the bus continued its journey, the adrenaline began to wear off, and Ethan found himself shaking slightly. The reality of what he'd done, confronting an adult, risking his own safety, began to sink in. Part of him couldn't believe he'd actually done it. The elderly woman seemed to sense his turmoil. She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "What's your name, dear?" "Ethan," he replied. "Ethan Morgan." "Well, Ethan Morgan," she said with a warm smile, "I won't forget what you did today. My name is Margaret Thornton, and I'd very much like to thank you properly. Would you mind if I spoke with your parents or your school?" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure how his parents would react to hearing about what happened. Would they be proud? Or would they be angry that he'd put himself in danger? I'm not sure," he said hesitantly. "My mom worries a lot, and I don't want to upset her." Margaret nodded understandingly. "Of course, dear. But what you did today was truly special. It deserves recognition. Perhaps we can figure out a way to let them know that doesn't cause undue worry." As the bus approached Ethan's stop, Margaret quickly scribbled something on a piece of paper and handed it to him. "This is my contact information. If you change your mind about letting me thank you properly, please have your parents get in touch." Ethan took the paper, tucking it carefully into his pocket. As he stood to leave, Margaret caught his hand. "Remember, Ethan," she said earnestly, "the world needs more people like you. People who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Don't ever lose that courage." With those words ringing in his ears, Ethan stepped off the bus. As he watched it pull away, he felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: pride, fear, excitement, and uncertainty. He had no idea that his simple act of bravery was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. As he turned to walk towards his school, Ethan's hand unconsciously went to his pocket, feeling the crisp edge of Margaret's contact information. Little did he know, that small piece of paper would soon become a ticket to an extraordinary journey, one that would challenge him, inspire him, and ultimately shape him into the person he was meant to be. The autumn leaves crunched under his feet as he made his way to the school entrance, the memory of the morning's events still vivid in his mind. The day that had started like any other had become something extraordinary, and deep down, Ethan knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Aftermath and reflection. The final bell rang, signaling the end of another school day. Ethan Morgan lingered at his locker, his movements slow and distracted. The events of the morning still played on repeat in his mind, like a movie he couldn't quite believe he'd starred in. Earth to Ethan. A hand waved in front of his face, startling him out of his reverie. His best friend, Jessie, stood beside him, her dark curls bouncing as she tilted her head in concern. "You've been spacey all day. What's up?" Ethan hesitated. He hadn't told anyone about what happened on the bus. Part of him worried they wouldn't believe him, or worse, they'd think he was bragging. But Jessie had been his friend since kindergarten. If anyone would understand, it would be her. Something happened this morning, he began hesitantly. As they walked out of the school, Ethan recounted the events on the bus. Jessie's eyes widened as he described confronting the drunk man and defending Margaret. "Ethan, that's incredible," Jessie exclaimed when he finished. "You're like a real-life superhero or something." Ethan felt his cheeks grow warm. "I don't know about that. I was terrified the whole time." "That's what makes it even braver," Jessie insisted. "You did it even though you were scared. That's what real courage is." As they approached the corner where they usually parted ways, Jessie gave Ethan a quick hug. "I'm proud of you, you know," she said softly. "Just be careful, okay? I don't want my best friend getting hurt playing hero." Ethan nodded, touched by her concern. As he watched Jessie head down her street, he felt a small surge of confidence. Maybe what he did really was special. That feeling of pride, however, began to waver as he approached his own home. The Morgan house was a modest 2-story building, its paint slightly faded and the small front yard in need of mowing. Ethan could hear the familiar chaos even before he opened the door, his younger siblings arguing over a toy, the TV blaring cartoons, and his mom's voice rising above it all, trying to restore order. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped inside. "I'm home," he called out. Sarah Morgan appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But her face lit up at the sight of her eldest son. "There you are, sweetie," she said, pulling him into a quick hug. "How was school?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. How could he even begin to explain what had happened? "It was interesting," he said finally. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Interesting how?" Before Ethan could respond, his younger brother Max came tearing through the living room, closely pursued by their sister Lily. "Mom, Max took my doll," Lily wailed. Sarah sighed, her attention immediately diverted. "Max, give your sister back her toy." "Ethan, can you start on your homework? I need to get dinner started before your father gets home." Ethan nodded, a mix of relief and disappointment washing over him. Part of him had wanted to tell his mom everything, to see the pride in her eyes. But another part was glad for the reprieve. He wasn't sure he was ready to relive the morning's events just yet. As he climbed the stairs to his room, Ethan's hand brushed against the piece of paper in his pocket, Margaret Thornton's contact information. He pulled it out, staring at the elegant handwriting. Should he tell his parents about her offer to thank him? What would that even entail? Sitting at his small desk, Ethan tried to focus on his homework, but his mind kept wandering. The face of the drunk man loomed in his memory, twisted with anger. What if he'd actually hurt Ethan? Or Margaret? The what-ifs started to pile up, making his stomach churn. A knock at his door jolted him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door opened to reveal his father, James Morgan, still in his work uniform from the factory. Despite the long day, he managed a warm smile for his son. "Hey, champ, your mom said you were acting a bit off. Everything okay?" Ethan hesitated, then made a decision. "Dad, can I talk to you about something?" James' expression turned serious. He came into the room, sitting on the edge of Ethan's bed. "Of course, son, what's on your mind?" Slowly, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, Ethan recounted the morning's events. He described the drunk man, the fear he'd felt, and his decision to stand up for Margaret. As he spoke, he watched his father's face, trying to gauge his reaction. When Ethan finished, James was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and pulled Ethan into a tight hug. "I am so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan felt tears pricking at his eyes, overwhelmed by the relief of sharing his story and the warmth of his father's approval. "You're not mad?" he asked, his voice muffled against his dad's shirt. James pulled back, looking Ethan in the eye. "Mad? No, son. I'm not going to pretend I'm not worried. The situation could have been dangerous. But you did the right thing. You stood up for someone who needed help. That takes real courage." "I was scared," Ethan admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," James said gently. "It means doing the right thing even when you are scared. And that's exactly what you did." They talked for a while longer, James listening patiently as Ethan worked through his jumbled emotions about the incident. Finally, Ethan pulled out Margaret's contact information and showed it to his father. James studied the paper thoughtfully. "This is a big decision, Ethan. Why don't we sleep on it and talk about it as a family in the morning? For now, let's go down and have some dinner. I think your mom should hear about your adventure too." As they headed downstairs, Ethan felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The fear and uncertainty that had been gnawing at him all day began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of pride. Maybe Jesse was right. Maybe what he'd done really was special. Dinner that night was a lively affair. Sarah alternated between expressing pride in Ethan's actions and anxiety over what could have happened. Max and Lily listened to the story with wide-eyed excitement, immediately declaring their big brother a hero and peppering him with questions. As Ethan lay in bed that night, his mind was still buzzing with the events of the day. The fear he felt on the bus seemed distant now, overshadowed by the warmth of his family's support and the growing realization that he'd made a real difference in someone's life. Just before he drifted off to sleep, Ethan's thoughts turned to Margaret Thornton. He wondered if he'd ever see her again, and what she'd meant about thanking him properly. Little did he know that Margaret had plans that would change the course of his life in ways he couldn't even imagine. The next morning dawned bright and clear. As Ethan got ready for school, he felt a new sense of purpose. The world seemed a little different now, a place where ordinary people like him could make a difference. At breakfast, James brought up the topic of Margaret's contact information. "Your mother and I have been talking," he said, sharing a look with Sarah. "We think it might be okay to let this Margaret Thornton know how to reach us. But," he added, seeing Ethan's excitement, "we want to be involved every step of the way. No meeting her alone, understand?" Ethan nodded eagerly. "Of course, Dad, I promise." As he headed out for the bus stop, Ethan felt a mix of nerves and excitement. He had no idea what Margaret had in mind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. The bus pulled up and Ethan climbed aboard. Miss Johnson, the driver, gave him a warm smile and a wink. "Morning, hero," she said quietly. Ethan blushed but smiled back. As he made his way to his seat, he noticed a few of the regular passengers nodding at him in recognition. The elderly man who always sat in the front even tipped his hat. Settling into his seat, Ethan gazed out the window at the passing city. Yesterday, he'd been just another kid on the bus. Today, he felt different. Not because he thought he was better than anyone else, but because he'd discovered something about himself, a strength he didn't know he had. As the bus rolled on towards school, Ethan's hand went to his pocket, where Margaret's contact information was safely tucked away. He had a feeling that piece of paper was going to lead to something extraordinary. And for once in his life, Ethan Morgan felt ready for whatever adventure might come his way. An unexpected visitor. The following day started like any other for Ethan Morgan. He woke to the sound of his alarm, stumbled through his morning routine, and just barely made it to the bus on time. As he settled into his seat, he couldn't help but glance at the spot where he'd met Margaret Thornton. It felt strange to see someone else sitting there, as if that space should have been preserved somehow, a monument to the moment that had changed everything. At school, Ethan found himself distracted, his mind wandering from his lessons to wonder about Margaret. Had his parents called her yet? What did she have in mind to thank him? The possibilities ranged from the mundane to the fantastic in his imagination. It wasn't until lunch that Ethan noticed something was different. A buzz of excitement seemed to be running through the school. Students were clustering in small groups, whispering and pointing towards the parking lot. Curious, Ethan made his way to a window, Jesse close behind him. "What's going on?" he asked a nearby classmate. The boy turned, his eyes wide with excitement. "There's a Mercedes in the parking lot. A really fancy one. Everyone's wondering who it belongs to." Ethan felt a strange flutter in his stomach. Surely it couldn't be, could it? Before he could ponder further, the school secretary appeared in the cafeteria doorway. Her eyes scanned the room before landing on Ethan. "Ethan Morgan, you're needed in the principal's office." A chorus of oohs rose from the other students, but Ethan barely heard them. His heart was pounding as he followed the secretary through the halls. This had to be about Margaret, he was sure of it. As they approached the principal's office, Ethan saw his parents standing outside, looking as confused as he felt. His mother rushed to him as soon as she saw him. "Ethan, honey, do you know what this is about?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with worry. Ethan shook his head, though he had his suspicions. "No idea, Mom." The principal, Mr. Hawkins, opened his door and ushered them in. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, Ethan, thank you for coming. We have a rather unusual situation." As they entered the office, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There, sitting in one of the chairs, was Margaret Thornton. She looked even more elegant than he remembered, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than his dad's monthly salary. Margaret stood as they entered, a warm smile lighting up her face. "Ethan," she said softly, "it's wonderful to see you again." Mr. Hawkins cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thornton here has quite a story to tell. Perhaps you'd like to explain, ma'am." Margaret nodded, turning to face Ethan's parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, I'm not sure if Ethan told you about our encounter on the bus yesterday morning." Sarah nodded, her arm protectively around Ethan's shoulders. "He did. We're very proud of him." "As you should be," Margaret said emphatically. "Your son's actions were nothing short of heroic. I've seen grown men hesitate to intervene in such situations, yet Ethan didn't hesitate to stand up for a stranger." James Morgan puffed up with pride, but there was still confusion in his eyes. "We appreciate that, Mrs. Thornton, but I'm not sure I understand why this couldn't have been handled with a phone call." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Because, Mr. Morgan, a simple thank you doesn't seem adequate for what Ethan did. You see, I'm not just a little old lady who rides the bus. Until my retirement last year, I was the CEO of Thornton Industries." The name hung in the air for a moment before recognition dawned on everyone's faces. Thornton Industries was one of the largest companies in the state, employing thousands and contributing millions to the local economy. "I spent my career looking for potential," Margaret continued, "for people with not just intelligence but character. People who do the right thing, even when it's difficult. And in Ethan, I see enormous potential." She turned to face Ethan directly. "Young man, I'd like to offer you a full scholarship to Westfield Academy." The room fell silent. Westfield Academy was the most prestigious private school in the city, known for its rigorous academics and influential alumni. It was the kind of school Ethan had never even dreamed of attending. Sarah was the first to find her voice. "Mrs. Thornton, that's incredibly generous, but we couldn't possibly." Margaret held up a hand to stop her. "Please hear me out. This isn't charity, Mrs. Morgan. It's an investment. An investment in a young man who I believe has the potential to do great things. The scholarship would cover tuition, books, uniforms, everything. All I ask is that Ethan continues to work hard and to always stand up for what's right." Ethan felt as if he were in a dream. This couldn't be real, could it? He looked at his parents, trying to gauge their reactions. His father looked stunned, while his mother seemed to be on the verge of tears. Mr. Hawkins cleared his throat again. "This is, of course, a big decision. Perhaps the Morgans would like some time to discuss it privately." Margaret nodded. "Of course. I don't mean to overwhelm you. Please take all the time you need to consider the offer. Here's my card. Feel free to call me with any questions or concerns." As Margaret stood to leave, she paused by Ethan's chair. "Whatever you decide, Ethan, never forget what you did on that bus. That kind of courage and compassion is rare, and it's something to be cherished." With that, she was gone, leaving behind a room full of shocked silence. Mr. Hawkins was the first to speak. "Well, Ethan, it seems you've made quite an impression. Why don't you and your parents take the rest of the day to talk this over? This is a big decision after all." In a daze, Ethan followed his parents out of the school. The fancy Mercedes was gone from the parking lot, but its impact lingered. As they drove home, the car was filled with a mix of excited chatter and worried murmurs. "It's an incredible opportunity," James kept saying, his voice filled with awe. Sarah, however, seemed more cautious. "It's a different world, that school. I don't want Ethan to feel out of place." Ethan remained quiet, his mind whirling with possibilities. Westfield Academy. The name alone conjured images of ivy-covered buildings and students destined for greatness. Could he really belong in a place like that? As they pulled into their driveway, Ethan finally spoke up. "What do you think I should do?" His parents exchanged a look. "This is your decision, son," James said gently. "We'll support you no matter what, but it's your future we're talking about here." Inside, they gathered around the kitchen table, the place where all major family decisions were made. Sarah made a pot of coffee, and they talked for hours, weighing the pros and cons. "The education would be top-notch," James pointed out. "But what about your friends here?" Sarah countered. "And the commute would be long." Round and round they went, considering every angle. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan found his initial shock wearing off, replaced by a growing sense of excitement. Yes, it would be challenging. Yes, it would mean leaving behind the familiar comfort of his current school. But wasn't that what growing up was all about? Taking chances, pushing yourself to be better. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the kitchen, Ethan took a deep breath. "I want to do it," he said, his voice steady. "I want to go to Westfield." His parents looked at him, then at each other. Slowly, they nodded. "Okay," son, James said, reaching out to squeeze Ethan's shoulder. "If you're sure, then we're behind you 100%. Sarah wiped a tear from her eye. My little boy, off to a fancy private school. Who would have thought? Ethan grinned, feeling a mix of nervousness and exhilaration. "I promise I'll work hard," he said. "I won't let Mrs. Thornton down, or you guys." As the Morgans embraced, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. In the span of 2 days, Ethan's life had changed dramatically, all because he'd chosen to stand up for what was right. Later that night, as Ethan lay in bed, he thought about Margaret Thornton's words. That kind of courage and compassion is rare, and it's something to be cherished. He made a silent vow to himself. No matter what challenges lay ahead at Westfield Academy, he would hold on to that courage and compassion. He would make Margaret proud. He would make his parents proud. But most importantly, he would make himself proud. As he drifted off to sleep, Ethan's dreams were filled with images of what was to come. New classrooms, new friends, new challenges. It was terrifying and thrilling all at once. But deep down, Ethan knew he was ready. After all, if he could stand up to a drunk man on a bus, he could handle anything. Tomorrow would bring phone calls to make, forms to fill out, and a whole new life to prepare for. But for now, Ethan Morgan slept soundly, a smile on his face, ready to embrace the unexpected adventure that lay ahead. A life-changing opportunity. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity for Ethan Morgan and his family. There were meetings with Westfield Academy administrators, placement tests to take, and a seemingly endless array of forms to fill out. Through it all, Margaret Thornton remained a steady presence, smoothing over any obstacles that arose with a well-placed phone call or a gentle word of encouragement. As the first day of school approached, Ethan found himself oscillating between excitement and terror. The night before his Westfield debut, he stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his new uniform for the 100th time. The crisp white shirt, navy blazer with a school crest, and neatly pressed trousers felt alien on him, a costume for a role he wasn't sure he could play. "You look very handsome," his mother said from the doorway, her eyes misty with pride and a hint of sadness. Ethan turned, trying to smile despite the butterflies in his stomach. "Thanks, Mom. I don't know if I'm ready for this." Sarah crossed the room and pulled her son into a tight hug. "Oh, sweetheart, you're more ready than you know. Remember, Westfield is lucky to have you, not the other way around." The next morning dawned bright and clear. Ethan's usual bus ride was replaced by a long commute in his father's car, the familiar sights of his neighborhood giving way to the manicured lawns and stately homes of the city's wealthier districts. As they pulled up to Westfield Academy's imposing gates, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The school looked like something out of a movie. Ivy-covered brick buildings, immaculate gardens, and students who all seemed to exude an air of confidence and privilege. "Remember, son," James said as Ethan prepared to get out of the car, "you earned your place here. Hold your head high." With a deep breath, Ethan stepped out of the car and into his new life. The first few hours were a blur of introductions, orientation sessions, and trying not to get lost in the sprawling campus. Ethan's head spun with information about class schedules, extracurricular activities, and school traditions that dated back centuries. It wasn't until lunchtime that Ethan had a moment to catch his breath. He stood in the grand dining hall, tray in hand, scanning the room for a place to sit. The tables seemed to be divided along invisible lines, the athletes here, the theater kids there, the academic overachievers in another corner. "Hey, new kid," a voice called out. Ethan turned to see a boy about his age waving him over. "You look lost. Want to join us?" Grateful for the lifeline, Ethan made his way to the table. The boy who had called him over introduced himself as Alex, and quickly set about introducing the others: Mia, a girl with bright blue hair and an easy smile; Zach, who was buried in a thick book but offered a friendly nod; and Lydia, whose sharp eyes seemed to be taking in every detail of Ethan's appearance. "So," Lydia said as Ethan sat down, "what's your story? Westfield doesn't get many new students, especially not in our year." Ethan hesitated. How much should he tell them? Would they think he was bragging if he mentioned the scholarship? Before he could decide, Alex jumped in. "Oh, come on, Lydia. Give the guy a chance to breathe before you start the inquisition." Mia leaned in, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "I heard a rumor that you got some kind of special scholarship. Is that true?" Ethan felt his cheeks grow warm. Yeah, it's kind of a long story." To his surprise, instead of judgment or skepticism, he was met with genuine interest. As he recounted the story of the bus incident and Margaret Thornton's offer, Ethan found himself relaxing. These kids weren't so different from his old friends, even if they wore fancier clothes and used bigger words. "Wait," Zach said, finally looking up from his book. "Margaret Thornton. As in Thornton Industries. That's... wow." Lydia nodded, looking impressed despite herself. "Looks like we've got a real-life hero in our midst." Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Alex said firmly, "you did what everyone should do, but what most people don't. That's different." As lunch went on, the conversation shifted to other topics: classes they were looking forward to, teachers to watch out for, the upcoming school events. Ethan found himself laughing and joining in, the knot of anxiety in his stomach slowly unwinding. But the day wasn't over yet. As Ethan made his way to his afternoon classes, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. The other students seemed to breeze through complex mathematical equations and literary analyses that left Ethan's head spinning. In his last class of the day, Advanced Literature, Ethan found himself staring at a poem that might as well have been written in another language. As the teacher, Dr. Harlow, began to ask questions, Ethan sank lower in his seat, praying he wouldn't be called on. But of course, that's exactly what happened. "Mr. Morgan," Dr. Harlow said, her piercing gaze settling on Ethan, Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on the author's use of metaphor in the third stanza. Ethan felt his mouth go dry. He looked down at his notes, which consisted of little more than confused doodles in the margins. Just as he was about to admit defeat, a memory surfaced. His old English teacher, Mr. Jacobs, talking about how to approach difficult texts. When in doubt, he had said, start with what you know and build from there. Taking a deep breath, Ethan decided to take a chance. Well, he began slowly, I'm not sure I fully understand the metaphor, but the imagery in that stanza reminds me of a stormy sea. Maybe the author is comparing the turbulence of the sea to the turmoil of human emotions. There was a moment of silence. Then, to Ethan's amazement, Dr. Harlow smiled. An interesting interpretation, Mr. Morgan. Can you elaborate on that? As Ethan continued to talk, growing more confident with each word, he saw nods of agreement from some of his classmates. By the time he finished, Dr. Harlow was beaming. Excellent insight, Mr. Morgan. It's refreshing to hear a new perspective. As class ended, Ethan felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Mia from lunch. Nice job, she said with a grin. For a second there, I thought Harlow was going to eat you alive, but you really turned it around. Ethan smiled back, a warm glow of pride spreading through his chest. Maybe he did belong here after all. As he walked out of the school gates that afternoon, Ethan spotted his father's car waiting for him. But instead of feeling relief at the sight of something familiar, he felt a twinge of regret. For the first time, he was eager to see what the next day at Westfield would bring. How was it? James asked as Ethan climbed into the car. Ethan thought for a moment, then smiled. It was challenging, but in a good way, I think. As they drove home, Ethan filled his father in on the day's events. He talked about his new friends, the intimidating classes, and his small triumph in Dr. Harlow's class. Sounds like you're off to a great start, son, James said, pride evident in his voice. That night, as Ethan prepared for bed, he noticed the framed photo on his nightstand. It was a picture of him with his old friends from his previous school, taken just a few weeks ago at a goodbye party they had thrown for him. For a moment, a pang of homesickness hit him. He missed the easy familiarity of his old life, the comfort of knowing exactly where he fit in. But then he thought about the day he had just experienced. The challenges he had faced, the new friends he had made, the vast world of knowledge that was opening up before him. Yes, it was scary. Yes, it was difficult, but it was also exhilarating. As he drifted off to sleep, Ethan's last thoughts were of Margaret Thornton's words on that fateful day in the principal's office. I see enormous potential in you, she had said. For the first time, Ethan was starting to see it too. The next morning, as Ethan put on his Westfield uniform, he stood a little taller, his movements more confident. He was still the same Ethan Morgan who had stood up for a stranger on a bus. But he was also becoming something more, a student of Westfield Academy, a young man stepping into a world of new possibilities. As he headed out the door, ready to face another day of challenges and opportunities, Ethan couldn't help but smile. This was more than just a new school. It was a chance to discover who he truly was and who he could become, and he was ready to make the most of it. Challenges and growth. As weeks turned into months, Ethan Morgan found himself settling into a rhythm at Westfield Academy. The initial shock of his new surroundings had worn off, replaced by a growing sense of belonging. Yet, with each passing day, new challenges arose, testing Ethan's resolve and pushing him to grow in ways he never expected. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan sat in the school's vast library, surrounded by towering shelves of books. He was hunched over a particularly difficult calculus problem, his forehead creased in concentration. Despite his best efforts, the solution eluded him. Stuck? A voice asked. Ethan looked up to see Zach, his quiet classmate from lunch, sliding into the seat across from him. Ethan nodded, pushing his textbook across the table. I've been staring at this for an hour, and I still can't figure it out. Zach glanced at the problem, then back at Ethan. You know, there's no shame in asking for help. That's why we have study groups. Study groups. Ethan echoed, feeling a twinge of embarrassment. He'd been so focused on proving he belonged at Westfield that he'd been reluctant to admit when he was struggling. Zuck nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Yeah, a bunch of us meet every Tuesday and Thursday after school. You should join us. That Thursday, Ethan found himself in one of the school's smaller classrooms, surrounded by a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. To his surprise, he saw that even some of the students he'd assumed were effortlessly brilliant were there, asking questions and helping others. As the session progressed, Ethan felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He wasn't alone in finding the work challenging. More importantly, he realized that admitting he needed help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a crucial part of learning and growing. But academic challenges weren't the only ones Ethan faced. As he became more integrated into Westfield's social scene, he found himself navigating a world very different from what he was used to. One weekend, Ethan received an invitation to a party at Alex's house. Excited at the prospect of hanging out with his new friends outside of school, Ethan eagerly accepted. However, as he approached Alex's home, a sprawling mansion that made Ethan's house look like a dollhouse in comparison, he felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. Inside, the party was in full swing. Students from Westfield mingled effortlessly, discussing summer homes, family yachts, and exotic vacations. Ethan found himself standing awkwardly in a corner, clutching a soda and feeling hopelessly out of place. "Hey, scholarship kid," a voice called out. Ethan turned to see Trevor, one of the more popular boys in their year, approaching with a smirk. "How's it feel to be living the high life? Bet this is all pretty new for you, huh?" Ethan felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Back off, Trevor," Mia's voice cut through the awkward silence. She appeared at Ethan's side, her blue hair a stark contrast to her fierce expression. "Ethan's here because he earned it. Can you say the same about your place at Westfield?" Trevor's smirk faltered, and he muttered something under his breath before slinking away. Mia turned to Ethan, her expression softening. "Don't let jerks like him get to you. You belong here just as much as anyone else." Ethan nodded gratefully, but the incident left him shaken. That night, as his dad picked him up from the party, Ethan was uncharacteristically quiet. "Everything okay, son?" James asked, glancing at Ethan with concern. Ethan sighed, then slowly began to open up about his feelings of inadequacy and the constant pressure he felt to prove himself. To his surprise, his father chuckled softly. "You know, Ethan, when I first started at the factory, I felt the same way," James said. "I was surrounded by guys who'd been doing the job for years. I felt like an imposter, always worried they'd figure out I didn't belong." Ethan looked at his father in surprise. "Really? But you're great at your job. Everyone at the factory respects you." James nodded. "That's because I stopped trying to be someone I wasn't. I focused on doing my best work and being true to myself. And you know what? People respected that a lot more than if I'd tried to pretend I was something I wasn't." The next day at school, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about his father's words. As he walked into his first class, he made a decision. He was going to stop trying to fit in and start being himself. In English class, when Dr. Harlow asked for interpretations of a particularly obscure poem, Ethan raised his hand. Instead of trying to sound sophisticated, he gave an honest response, relating the poem to his own experiences. To his amazement, the class responded positively. Even Dr. Harlow seemed impressed. "That's a unique perspective, Mr. Morgan," she said with a smile. "It's refreshing to hear an interpretation that comes from personal experience rather than rote analysis." As the weeks went on, Ethan found that embracing his background and unique perspective not only made him feel more comfortable, but also enriched his contributions to class discussions. His classmates began to seek out his opinions, valuing the different viewpoint he brought to the table. But perhaps the greatest challenge and opportunity for growth came in the form of Westfield's annual charity gala. Each year, students were tasked with organizing a fundraising event for a cause of their choice. As Ethan sat in the auditorium, listening to the headmaster explain the project, an idea began to form in his mind. When it came time for students to propose their charity ideas, Ethan stood up, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "I'd like to propose a fundraiser for the city's public transportation system," he said, specifically to fund a program that would provide free bus passes to low-income students and elderly residents. A murmur ran through the auditorium. It wasn't the usual type of cause Westfield students championed. But as Ethan continued to speak, sharing his personal experiences and the impact such a program could have, he saw heads nodding in agreement. To his surprise, Lydia stood up next. "I think it's a great idea," she said. "It's about time we did something that directly impacts our local community." One by one, other students voiced their support. Even Trevor, who had mocked Ethan at the party, grudgingly admitted it was a worthy cause. As Ethan worked with his classmates to organize the gala, he found himself drawing on skills he didn't even know he had. He negotiated with local businesses for donations, coordinated with the city's transportation department, and even gave a speech at the event itself. The night of the gala, as Ethan stood on stage looking out at the sea of faces, his classmates, their parents, and even Margaret Thornton herself, he felt a surge of pride. Not just in the success of the event, which had raised far more money than anyone had expected, but in himself. He had faced academic challenges and overcome them. He had navigated social pressures and stayed true to himself. And now, he had used his unique perspective to make a real difference in his community. As he stepped off the stage to thunderous applause, Ethan caught sight of his parents in the audience. Their faces shone with pride, and Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He had come so far from that day on the bus, yet in many ways, he was still the same Ethan, the boy who wanted to do the right thing, no matter how difficult it might be. Later that night, as the gala wound down, Margaret Thornton approached Ethan. "I knew I saw something special in you," she said, her eyes twinkling. "But you've exceeded even my highest expectations. Well done, Ethan." As Ethan walked out of the school with his parents, he felt a sense of contentment wash over him. The path ahead was still long, and he knew there would be more challenges to face. But for the first time, he felt truly ready to meet them head-on. Ethan Morgan, the boy from the bus, had grown into a young man who was making his mark on the world. And this, he realized, was just the beginning. Coming full circle. 5 years had passed since Ethan Morgan's fateful bus ride and his life-changing scholarship to Westfield Academy. Now, on a warm spring morning, Ethan stood at the podium in Westfield's grand auditorium, adjusting his graduation gown and trying to calm the butterflies in his stomach. As valedictorian, he was about to address not only his classmates and their families, but also a host of distinguished guests, including Margaret Thornton herself. Ethan's eyes scanned the audience, finding the beaming faces of his parents, his sister Lily, and his little brother Max, who was now old enough to appreciate the significance of this moment. Taking a deep breath, Ethan began his speech. "Fellow graduates, esteemed faculty, family, and friends, when I first stepped through the gates of Westfield Academy, I felt like I had entered another world. A world of opportunity, yes, but also a world where I wasn't sure I belonged." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his classmates, Alex, Mia, Zach, Lydia, and even Trevor, who had eventually become a friend. "But as I stand here today, I realize that Westfield isn't another world at all. It's very much a part of our world, a world that's complex, challenging, and often unfair, but also a world full of potential for positive change." Ethan went on to recount some of the challenges and triumphs of the past 5 years, the late-night study sessions, the heated debates in ethics class, the successful charity galas that had become an annual tradition. He spoke about the importance of perseverance, of staying true to oneself, and of using one's privileges and abilities to make a difference in the lives of others. As he concluded his speech, Ethan's voice grew passionate. As we leave Westfield today, we carry with us not just the knowledge we've gained from our classes, but the understanding that we have the power and the responsibility to shape the world around us. Whether it's standing up to injustice, pursuing breakthrough scientific research, or simply showing kindness to a stranger on the bus, each of us has the ability to create positive change. The auditorium erupted in applause as Ethan stepped down from the podium. As he made his way back to his seat, he caught Margaret Thornton's eye. She gave him a small nod, her eyes shining with pride. After the ceremony, as families and friends mingled on the school lawn, Ethan found himself surrounded by a sea of well-wishers. His parents enveloped him in a tight hug, their eyes misty with tears of joy. "We are so proud of you, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion. James clapped his son on the back. "You've come so far, Ethan, and you did it all on your own merit." As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret Thornton approached the Morgan family. "Congratulations, Ethan," she said warmly. "Your speech was inspiring. Have you given any thought to what you'll do next?" Ethan nodded, a mix of excitement and nervousness in his voice. "Actually, I have. I've been accepted into a joint law and public policy program at the State University." Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Not an Ivy League school. With your grades and accomplishments, I'm sure you had your pick of top-tier universities." Ethan smiled. "I did have other offers," he admitted, "but I decided to stay closer to home. The State University has an excellent program, and..." He hesitated for a moment before continuing, "I want to use what I've learned to make a difference in my own community." Margaret's face broke into a wide smile. "I should have known," she said softly. "You never cease to amaze me, Ethan Morgan." As the day wound down, Ethan found himself drawn to the school gates. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the street beyond, remembering the boy he had been when he first walked through those gates 5 years ago. Suddenly, a familiar sound caught his attention. The city bus was pulling up to the stop just outside the school. Without really thinking about it, Ethan jogged over, still in his graduation gown. As the doors opened, he saw a young boy, no more than 12, struggling to help an elderly man with a cane board the bus. The other passengers seemed impatient, some muttering under their breath about the delay. Without hesitation, Ethan stepped forward. "Here, let me help you," he said, gently assisting the elderly man up the steps. The young boy looked up at Ethan with wide eyes, taking in the graduation gown. "Thanks, mister," he said. "I was worried no one would help." Ethan smiled, remembering his own fears and doubts from years ago. "Sometimes all it takes is one person to make a difference," he said. "Never be afraid to be that person." As the bus pulled away, Ethan felt a sense of déjà vu. He turned to see Margaret Thornton standing nearby, a knowing smile on her face. "It seems we've come full circle," she said. Ethan nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I never properly thanked you," he said, "for everything you've done for me." Margaret shook her head. "You thanked me in the best way possible, Ethan, by making the most of the opportunity you were given and by continuing to be the kind of person who stands up for others." As they walked back towards the school, Margaret asked, "So, what's next for Ethan Morgan?" Ethan's eyes lit up as he began to share his plans. He talked about his ideas for urban development projects that could benefit low-income communities, his desire to work on education reform, and his dream of eventually running for local office. "I want to bridge the gap," he explained passionately, "between worlds like Westfield and the neighborhood where I grew up. I believe that when we break down these barriers, when we learn from each other and work together, that's when real change happens." Margaret listened intently, nodding in approval. "I have no doubt you'll accomplish great things, Ethan," she said. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" Ethan asked. "Never forget where you came from," Margaret said softly. "Your experiences, both here at Westfield and in your old neighborhood, have shaped you into who you are. That unique perspective is your greatest strength." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I promise," he said. As the sun began to set on his last day at Westfield, Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for the opportunity he'd been given, for the challenges he'd faced and overcome, for the friends he'd made, and for the person he'd become. But more than anything, he felt grateful for that moment on the bus 5 years ago, the moment when a scared but determined boy had chosen to stand up for what was right. That choice had set him on this path, and as he looked towards the future, Ethan knew he would continue to make that choice, again and again, no matter where life took him. As he walked back to join his family, Ethan Morgan stood tall, ready to step into the next chapter of his life. He carried with him the lessons of Westfield, the values instilled by his parents, and the courage of that boy on the bus. With these as his guide, he was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead and to continue making a positive difference in the world around him. The boy who had once felt out of place in 2 different worlds had grown into a young man ready to build bridges between them. And in doing so, Ethan Morgan had not only found his place, but had also discovered his purpose. As the Morgan family drove home that evening, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Ethan felt a sense of excitement for the future. He knew that his journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But armed with education, empathy, and the unwavering belief in the power of standing up for what's right, Ethan was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The story of the boy on the bus had come full circle, but for Ethan Morgan, it was just the opening chapter of a lifetime dedicated to making a difference, one courageous act at a time.